the disaster. Leaving one switch on manual could have led to all the other problems the plane faced. To prove he's right, he takes an unusual step. 4 months after the disaster, he takes an Olympic Airlines 737 on the same route flown by the Helios jet. If he's right about what caused the crash, this plane should react exactly like the doomed airliner did.
Are we ready?
Make sure the P5 is set to manual.
It's hard to see.
In the cockpit, Soulakis has the crew turn the pressurization switch to manual. A green light indicates it's no longer on automatic. But in the bright glare of an early morning departure, the light is hard to see. As the reenactment flight climbs, oxygen is thinning quickly in the aircraft. The same thing happened on the Helios flight, triggering an alarm.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
The alarm sounded, and that alarm was misinterpreted. Most of flight crew, they will never face an alarm with no pressurization in all their flight career because it's a rare event.
Soulakis confirms that the alarm went off because of the dangerously low air pressure in the aircraft. But he also discovers that the sound itself is identical to the takeoff config warning.
We have a takeoff config warning on.
But even if the flight crew did misinterpret the first alarm, they still had another chance to determine what the real problem was. At almost 5,000 meters, the plane's master caution light flashed on and stayed on for almost a minute.
We now have a master caution.
But once again, the pilots misinterpreted the cause of the alarm. The master caution light can indicate that the plane's systems are overheating. But it can also tell pilots the oxygen masks are down. In this case, it was doing both at the same time. But since the crew didn't think they were having pressurization problems, they focused on the plane's cooling systems.
The alarm about the non-cooling was a side effect of non-pressurization. Actually, it was not really that there was a high temperature inside the avionics bay, but it was the sensors that they were supposed to measure the temperature and the pressure in that area sensed that something was wrong.
On the recreation flight, investigators monitor instruments recording the same events occurring on board their aircraft. At the same time, they also begin to feel the effects of the lack of oxygen.
The first feelings you'd start to have were your ears would pop and you'd start feeling pressure in your sinuses. As you climb higher, you begin to feel almost giddy. It's almost like having a couple of drinks of alcohol.
The dwindling oxygen levels could also help explain some of the crew's bizarre behavior. When the ground engineer asked about pressurization,
can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?
Captain Merton ignores the question and responds with one of his own.
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
You really don't notice it at first. It's amazing how subtle it can be in the early phases. They'd start feeling dizzy. They begin to lose the ability to think coherently. In a way, it traps you into the situation. You can't react to anything. Eventually, you're going to lose consciousness.
Soulakis believes that the captain may have been checking on the circuit breakers behind his seat when he and the co-pilot finally ran out of air. And unlike in the cabin, the oxygen masks in the cockpit do not automatically deploy if the atmosphere begins to thin.
Helios 522. Can you hear me?
On the other side of the locked cockpit door, no one in the cabin would have known that the plane was now flying itself. Nor would they have realized that a limitation of the passenger oxygen system had sealed the fate of everyone in the cabin. Passenger masks are supplied by a chemical generator above their seats. But the generators only produce enough oxygen to last about 12 minutes.
Well, the problem with the passenger masks is, for one thing, they're not designed to keep you oxygenated at a high altitude. What they're designed to do is give you enough oxygen so that you can survive until the pilots get the airplane down to a low altitude. And in almost every event where we've had a decompression, that's been perfectly adequate.
For those who did put their masks on, they would have remained conscious for several minutes until their oxygen ran out. Then they too would have passed out.
Once you get up to 34,000 feet, you're talking useful consciousness of 30 to 60 seconds. Most of the people, once the hypoxia begins to cause them to lose consciousness, they're just going to go to sleep.
Without a flight crew, Helios 522 would have continued to Athens on autopilot. When the crew didn't take control, the autopilot would have put the jet in a holding pattern as it flew over the airport. Exactly the same thing will happen on the reconstruction flight if cabin pressure isn't restored. Soulakis asks the co-pilot to reset the P5 panel to auto before the jet continues to climb to its cruising altitude of just over 10,000 meters. Then, as it approaches Athens, Soulakis also has an F-16 shadow the jet, performing the recreation. He wants to confirm that it was Andreas Prodromou at the controls of Flight 522 when it went down.
We dressed one of our guys with the uniform of the steward, and he came in, he sat on the captain's chair, and the F-16 was looking at him. He was confirming that it was exactly what he saw on the accident plane.
The reconstruction also answers another question about the tragic fate of Helios Flight 522. The cockpit voice recorder picked up several strange noises. They're heard just before Prodromou enters the cockpit. Soulakis confirms that these sounds were made by Prodromou using the electronic keypad to unlock the cockpit door.
We confirmed all those items and during the enactment flight, and it was very, very useful. It filled a lot of gaps we had.
Okay, take it down.
For Chief Investigator Soulakis, the reenactment flight has been convincing. There was no dramatic cabin failure. Instead, a series of small mistakes and misunderstandings had led to the worst air disaster in Greek history. "15 months after the crash, Greek authorities released the official report on Helios Airways Flight 522. But mysteries remain. What was happening in the cabin while the doomed airplane flew towards Athens? And why was Andreas Prodromou the only one conscious at the very end? Helios Flight 522 was the worst disaster in the history of Greek aviation. The final accident report details a tragic series of oversights and false assumptions made by the flight crew. But what the final report does not do is explain what happened in the cabin of the plane. What actions did the flight attendants take? And why was Andreas Prodromou still conscious after almost 3 hours?
Mayday. Mayday.
Interviews with Helios safety instructors and crew members paint a tragic picture of what may have occurred.
Everyone, please put your masks on. We're not sure what the trouble is, but remain calm and please remain seated.
Prodromou was sitting at the back of the cabin. When the oxygen masks